April 1241. The morning mist had barely lifted over the Hungarian plains when the ground began to shake. Thousands of hooves thundered across the earth, but these weren't European war horses. These were smaller, faster, deadlier. And riding them were warriors who had conquered half the known world. King Bela IV stood with his army of 50,000 men, the largest coalition Europe had ever assembled. Hungarian knights in their finest armor, German crusaders with swords blessed by priests, Polish cavalry who had never known defeat, Templars who feared nothing but God. They looked at the Mongol horde across the field and saw savages, barbarians on ponies, men who would break against European steel like waves against stone. They had no idea they were staring at the most sophisticated killing machine in human history. 3 days later, the rivers ran red, corpses stretched for miles, entire bloodlines were erased. And Europe realized, too late, that everything they knew about warfare was obsolete. The Mongols hadn't just won a battle. They had demonstrated a level of military genius that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They had turned 50,000 armored knights into a cautionary tale written in blood. This wasn't luck. This wasn't savagery. This was precision, strategy, centuries of evolution in the art of war, deployed against an enemy who thought heavy armor and castle walls made them invincible. The Mongols proved them wrong in the most brutal way imaginable. What happened in those 3 days at Mohi, Liegnitz, and the Hungarian countryside wasn't just a defeat. It was an execution. A masterclass in combined arms warfare, psychological operations. To understand what happened in 1241, we need to go back further, not to the battles themselves, but to the empire that created this unstoppable force. Because the Mongol military machine wasn't built in a generation. It was forged over centuries of survival on the harshest terrain on Earth. The Mongol steppes weren't fertile farmland. They were vast, brutal, and unforgiving. No cities could grow there. No kingdoms could take root. Only nomads survived, and they did it by becoming the most mobile, adaptable people on the planet. Every Mongol child learned to ride before they could walk. By age 5, they were firing arrows from horseback. By 10, they were hunting. By 15, they were warriors. But it was Genghis Khan who took these scattered tribes and turned them into something unprecedented. He didn't just unite the Mongols. He revolutionized warfare itself. He organized his forces into units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, each with clear chains of command. He promoted based on merit, not bloodline. He created a postal system that could transmit orders across thousands of miles in days. He developed siege weapons that could crack the strongest fortresses. And most importantly, he instilled absolute discipline and tactical flexibility. By 1241, the Mongols had already conquered China, Persia, and Russia. They had destroyed. The invasion began with reconnaissance, something European armies barely understood. For months before the attack, Mongol scouts had been mapping every road, every river crossing, every town in Hungary and Poland. They knew the terrain better than the locals. They knew where armies were stationed, how large they were, who commanded them. European nobles had no idea they were being studied like specimens. When the Mongols finally struck, they did it with multiple coordinated columns, something that required communication and logistics European armies couldn't match. One force headed into Poland, drawing out the Polish and German knights. Another invaded Hungary from the east. A third swept in from the south. Each moved with such speed that European scouts couldn't keep track of them. The first major engagement was at Liegnitz in Poland on April 9, 1241. Duke Henry II assembled a coalition of Polish knights, German crusaders, and Templar warriors, about 20,000 men, some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They saw the Mongol force, smaller and lighter, and assumed victory was certain. The Mongols employed a tactic they had perfected over decades, the feigned retreat. They engaged the European cavalry with light skirmishers, fired a few arrows, then turned and ran. The European knights trained to charge and break enemy lines took the bait. They spurred their heavy war horses forward, eager for glory. What they didn't see was the trap. As the knights pursued, they spread out, their formation breaking. Their horses, bred for power not endurance, began to tire. And then the Mongols turned. Fresh cavalry units appeared from the flanks and rear. The Europeans suddenly found themselves surrounded, exhausted, and unable to maneuver. But the real horror came next. The Mongols unleashed smokescreens, possibly gunpowder-based, something Europeans had never encountered. The battlefield disappeared into acrid fog. Knights couldn't see their commanders, couldn't hear orders, couldn't maintain formation. They were isolated in their armor, blind, panicking. And then the arrows came. Not the heavy crossbow bolts Europeans used, but lighter. King Bela IV had assembled an even larger force, perhaps 50,000 strong, at the Sajo River near the town of Mohi. He believed the river would protect him, that the Mongols couldn't cross without being slaughtered. He posted guards at the main bridge and settled in for the night. The Mongols, led by Generals Subutai and Batu Khan, demonstrated why they were the greatest military minds of their era. That night, while a small force noisily attacked the bridge, drawing the Hungarian defenders, the bulk of the Mongol army silently forded the river miles upstream. They didn't need bridges. They were steppe warriors. Rivers were just another obstacle. By dawn on April 11th, the Mongols were on both sides of the Hungarian camp. But they didn't attack immediately. First, they bombarded the camp with catapults and early rockets, Chinese technology that terrified the Europeans. Fire rained from the sky. Explosions tore through tents. Horses panicked. Men scrambled for their armor in chaos. When the Mongols finally charged, they hit from multiple directions simultaneously. The Hungarian camp descended into pandemonium. Knights tried to form up but couldn't find their units. Infantry broke and ran. The whole army collapsed into a mob. Here's where the Mongols revealed their most terrifying innovation. They deliberately left an escape route open. Western generals would have tried to encircle and annihilate. The Mongols knew something more subtle. When an army is surrounded, even common soldiers fight to the death. But give them hope of escape and discipline evaporates. Everyone becomes a refugee. The Hungarian army broke and fled west, and that's when the real slaughter began. For days, Mongol cavalry pursued the remnants, riding them down in small groups, killing methodically and efficiently. There was no mercy, no ransom, no prisoners, just extermination. By April 14th, the Hungarian army ceased to exist. King Bela barely escaped with his life. Estimates suggest 40,000 to 50,000 Europeans died in those 3 days of fighting and pursuit. Some historians call it the single worst military disaster in medieval European history. But what's most remarkable isn't the death toll. It's how it happened. The Mongols won through superior tactics, logistics, communication, and adaptability. They used combined arms warfare, coordinating cavalry, archers, and siege weapons seamlessly. They employed psychological warfare, spreading terror deliberately. They exploited every European weakness, the obsession with heavy cavalry charges, the lack of reconnaissance, the poor communication between allied forces, the inflexibility of feudal military structures. European knights were individually brave and well-equipped. After Mohi and Liegnitz, the Mongols stood at the gates of Western Europe. They had destroyed 2 major armies in the same week, hundreds of miles apart. Vienna lay open. Germany was defenseless. And then, inexplicably, they withdrew. The great Khan Ogedei had died in Mongolia. Mongol law required all princes to return for the election of a new Khan. Batu Khan pulled back his forces, and Europe was spared by accident of timing, not military success. But the damage was done. The myth of European invincibility was shattered. The Mongols had demonstrated that armor and castles weren't enough. That feudal levies couldn't match professional, disciplined armies. That warfare was evolving, and Europe was being left behind. It would take centuries for European military thought to catch up. The lessons of Mohi, the importance of reconnaissance, combined arms tactics, disciplined maneuvering, wouldn't be fully absorbed until the Renaissance. Some historians argue that the Mongol invasions actually accelerated European military development, forcing a continent to confront its obsolescence. And here's the darkest irony. The Mongols weren't inherently superior humans. They were simply better trained, better organized, and better led. They had a system that valued competence over nobility, strategy over honor, victory over glory. So what's the lesson here? What does a battle from the 13th century teach us today? Perhaps this, that confidence without competence is suicide. That tradition without adaptation is a death sentence. That no matter how strong you think you are, somewhere out there is someone who has studied harder, trained longer, and thought deeper. The European knights at Mohi weren't cowards. They were some of the bravest men of their generation, but bravery doesn't stop arrows. Armor doesn't help when you're surrounded, and individual heroism means nothing when you're facing a coordinated, professional military machine. The Mongols destroyed 50,000 European knights in 3 days because they understood something fundamental. Warfare isn't about individual combat. It's about systems, logistics, intelligence, and adaptability. It's about turning human beings into components of a larger machine, each part working in perfect synchronization. And in that sense, maybe the Mongols and the Spartans we talked about aren't so different. Both created military systems that dominated their eras. Both sacrificed individual humanity for collective strength. Both proved that with enough discipline and organization, relatively small forces can achieve the impossible. But both also showed the limits of such systems. Sparta bred itself into extinction. The Mongol Empire, for all its conquests, fragmented within a century. Because systems built purely on warfare, that value nothing but military strength, are unsustainable. They can conquer the world, but they can't hold it. The fields of Mohi are quiet now. The rivers have long since washed away the blood. But the lessons remain, written in the bones of 50,000 dead. Never underestimate your enemy. Never assume tradition equals superiority. And never forget that somewhere, someone is training harder than you.